Coming up on Network Africa. Tunisia president sacks head of state television. World leaders attend Global Education Summit in London, pledge support for universal education. Plus, South Africans angered by Israel's African Union observer status. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Teniola Shoboale. We begin by checking in on the situation in Tunisia. President Kais Saied has dismissed the head of the national television station, Mohamed Lassad Dahech, and appointed a provincial replacement. Earlier, Mr. Saied sacked a large number of senior government officials. He assumed executive and judicial powers over the weekend after suspending parliament and removing the prime minister. The president's opponents have accused him of staging a coup, but the president insists that he acted within his powers at a time of crisis. Over in Ethiopia, intense fighting is being reported in the Amhara region, the latest sign that the war in Tigray is spreading to neighboring regions. Officials in Amhara say federal soldiers as well as Amhara regional troops had been involved in the fighting against rebels of the Tigray People's Liberation Front. It comes as regions continue to mobilize forces to fight against the TPLF. Despite this, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's spokesperson says a unilateral ceasefire declared last month has not been suspended. Meanwhile, the UN humanitarian chief, Martin Griffiths, is visiting Ethiopia amid concerns of a worsening humanitarian crisis as fighting escalates. World leaders, including Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari, are gathered in London for the Global Partnership for Education Summit, which aims to raise $5 billion to support education in some of the world's poorest countries. Hosted by the UK and Kenya, it will raise funds for the next 5 years, creating an extra 88 million school places and supporting the learning of 175 million children. Well, let's take a listen to some of the comments so far.
Children are among those least at risk of severe disease or death from COVID-19. But the pandemic has hit the world's children hard in other ways. More than half the world's students have been affected by prolonged school closures and other disruptions to education. This has magnified inequities for already marginalized children, especially girls. Some children have been out of school for more than 9 months, increasing their risk of dropping out of education completely, jeopardizing their future employment prospects and their health. In this time of global crisis, coordinated investment in education is critical to provide a safe environment for children's education, health, well-being, and nutrition. That's why the safe reopening of schools is a priority for WHO.
We cannot achieve development and growth as a society without the educational empowerment of 50% of our population. The Somalia government is committed to ensuring the equitable access to quality education of our girls. When you educate a girl, you educate a whole society.
Well, to speak more on this, we have Liz Wallace from One Org. Liz, thank you so much for joining us on the program. Just give us an idea of what world leaders discussed today and the pledges made so far.
Well, good afternoon from London. So world leaders meeting here at the Global Education Summit are making commitments to fund the Global Partnership for Education, the world's largest international organization funding education for low and middle income countries. And we're starting to see some good commitments come in, both from donor governments, including the UK that's co-hosting this moment, and also from developing country partners, including from President Kenyatta, who's also co-hosting this summit here in London.
You know, the pandemic has worsened problems already facing schools around the world, with warnings that children who were forced out of school because of coronavirus might never return. How is one contributing to the discussions today?
Well, one, over the last few months, has been really trying to put a spotlight on the scale of the global learning crisis, which, as you've just been talking about, the global pandemic, you know, COVID-19 has made that learning crisis even worse. And at the height of the pandemic, we saw as many as 1.6 billion children around the world out of school. And so, yeah, one has been seeking to put a spotlight on that, you know, at a moment that obviously countries are focusing on both a health emergency, but really education and children not being able to access learning has become a silent emergency during the pandemic. And so we've been, as I say, putting a spotlight on that and calling on governments around the world to continue to invest in education. And specifically ahead of this summit today, we've been asking governments to ensure that the Global Partnership for Education is fully financed so that it's able to meet those goals that you've already spoken about, enabling a further 175 million children to access learning over the next 5 years, and an extra 88 million children to attend school, because that's going to be critical to ensuring that children are able to return to school and resume their learning post the pandemic.
Well, one campaign also launched the Lost Potential Education Tracker. What does that tracker tell us, especially amid the global pandemic?
As you say, one launched the Lost Potential Tracker, which is a really kind of interactive visual tool of just the scale of the global learning crisis. What that tool shows us is that in just the next hour, 8,000 children in the world will hit their 10th birthday and will not be able to read and understand a simple story. And the 10th birthday is that critical milestone where children need to be able to transition from learning to read to reading to learn. And at the moment, we're seeing far too many children hit their 10th birthday without meeting that milestone. So as I've said, in just the next hour, that's going to be 8,000 children that don't meet that milestone. And this year alone, that will be 70 million children that don't reach it. And the impacts of that are going to be huge, not just for those children and individuals as they grow up, but also for their families and for their communities. And so we really we've been using the Lost Potential Tracker to really bring to life the scale of this crisis and to call on governments to address it and to finance education.
You know, it is a huge crisis, and the expectations for this summit is incredibly high. Liz Wallace, head of UK Advocacy, One Campaign, thank you so much for your time on the programme.
Thank you for having me.
Moving on now, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa says he's concerned by last week's decision to grant Israel observer status at the African Union. The country accuses the body of making a unilateral decision without consulting its 55 member countries. Israel had held observer status at the Organization of African Unity, OAU, which was disbanded and replaced by the AU in 2002. Its efforts to rejoin had been thwarted by some AU member countries.
With regard to the admission of Israel as an observer at the AU, we've expressed our deep concern about that, because it's a decision that was taken by the chair of the Commission and without consulting the member states. Certainly we were not consulted. We have views because we are concerned about what is happening in Palestine. The continued situation there in Palestine, in our view, militates against just warmly accepting Israel as an observer in Africa, particularly in view of the positions and the views that we have taken ourselves as a country against the state of Israel on this issue. So we are opposed to their admission. We are concerned about the decision that has been made. And as it is now, a number of countries on the continent are expressing their unhappiness and dissatisfaction.
Well, Professor Chris Isike is the president of the African Association of Political Science. He joins us now for more on this. Professor Isike, you know, after 20 years of diplomatic efforts, Israel finally has AU observer status. What does this mean for the bloc?
Thank you for having me, Teniola. Look, 46 countries in Africa already have diplomatic relations with Israel. So I don't think this would change anything in any significant way for these countries, especially those that have, you know, pro-Palestine proclivities, like South Africa, as we just heard. However, as a bloc, it will help to deepen, you know, cooperation between Israel and the African Union in advancing science and technology, fighting violent extremism and terrorism, as well as dealing with the COVID pandemic. For example, Africa needs to establish a vaccine production hub within the continent, and the Israelis will be happy to give this necessary, the necessary support to make this happen. There are also, historical ties between Israel and Africa generally, which can be leveraged to forge, closer development relations between both parties. But all of this would depend largely on the political willingness and technical capacity of different countries in Africa to actually leverage the opportunities that this presents. As Israel is, been pursuing this observer status for over 20 years, as you have said.
Mm. Yeah, and like you rightly said, Israel says this new status will enable it forge stronger cooperation with the AU on various aspects, which, is true. But you heard there President Ramaphosa saying he was concerned by this. And even the EFF has called for the AU Commission chairperson, that's Musa Faki Mohammed, to resign over this issue. Do you see this observer status being revoked at this point?
Let me answer that question last, but I agree by saying it's correct that South Africa has strongly expressed its disappointment with the African Union Commission chair over this, calling it, like the president said, unwarranted and unjust decision that was taken without consultation, with the assembly. Now, for me, this brewing tension, because it's still coming up. A lot of countries, like the president of South Africa just said, that are opposed to this. Algeria is one of them. But this growing tension is a product of the disconnect between the administrative and political powers of the African Union chair, position. So by the protocol establishing it, the Commission implements decisions and policies made by the Assembly of Heads of State. And there has been tensions between both organs of the African Union from inception, in 2002, over the limits of the powers of the Commission's chair. So I'm sure this issue will resurrect and test this tension in the coming days. But I don't believe that the observer status will be revoked, because although this is is of much political interest to countries like South Africa and many others that support the Palestinian cause, granting observer status to Israel is only fair, because Palestine already has that status with the AU. And if the AU is to practice its own principles, then it needs to be fair and just in dealing with all parties involved in the conflict. Also, it does not really change the pro-Palestinian stance of the African Union as a bloc. As Mahamat himself said, he indicated this to the Israeli ambassador, and told him that the AU remains committed to a two-state solution. So I don't think that it will be revoked. There will be a discussion. It will cause tension, but I don't see it being revoked.
All right, then, Professor Chris Isike, President of the African Association of Political Science. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us on Network Africa.
Thank you for having me.
Still to come on the program. Well, we meet Tani Toluwa, a young Nigerian chess champion with big plans. We'll tell you what his plans are in a moment. Please stay with us. Thanks for staying with us. Let's switch our attention to the COVID-19 pandemic now. Until now, relatively spared by the coronavirus crisis, Senegal is now facing an explosion of COVID-19 cases due to the spread of the Delta variant. In Dakar, officials say the health system is under great pressure as hospital beds dedicated to COVID patients are full and health personnel are on the verge of breaking down.
The ongoing record of COVID-19 surge has left the Senegalese capital without spare beds for the severest cases, as hundreds now flock to the health centers in the hope of getting vaccinated. Senegal has been spared the levels of death and infection seen in other parts of the world, recording just 59,286 cases and 1,307 deaths since the start of the crisis. But with over 15,000 of those cases registered just this month, the developing country's health services are now stretched dangerously thin.
The situation now is much more severe. What we're seeing now is just the tip of the iceberg. If, for example, we declare 1,000 positive tests, 50 of them serious, you can be sure there are 1,500 positive cases in reality, because there are a lot of people who have COVID and won't go to the hospital, or they will just do a rapid test that will come back positive and will just go treat themselves.
In Dakar, the current epicenter of the epidemic in Senegal, officials say every bed with supplemental oxygen for patients in severe respiratory distress is taken.
And I was in a cemetery yesterday. In one day alone, average, usually we bury about 3-4 people. Yesterday alone, they buried 35 people. So there is something going on. This is the world crisis.
The health ministry has vowed to ramp up vaccination efforts, and this week welcomed fresh deliveries of vaccines by China's Sinopharm and Johnson & Johnson, in addition to a shipment of AstraZeneca doses under the COVAX Global Vaccine Distribution Program.
And away from the COVID-19 pandemic, a huge container ship that blocked the Suez Canal in March, disrupting global trade, has arrived in the Dutch port of Rotterdam. The Ever Given, loaded with more than 18,000 containers, took 3 weeks to make the voyage from Egypt. The 400-meter ship was impounded for 3 months until the Suez Canal Authority reached a deal with the owners and insurers.
Yeah, so she arrived this morning at 5 o'clock. Which was as per plans. She had a delay last week because of some heavy winds in the channel. It has now been docked, and she's expected to be here till Monday. She will discharge all the Rotterdam and Hamburg cargo. After that, she will go to Felixstowe for the remainder of the cargo. Then she will be empty, and after she's empty, she go to Dunkirk for dry docking and to see if there's any repair necessary. There are some protocols in place. I noticed that the cranes were not next to the ship, which normally is a normal position. So there has been some sort of safety precautions being taken, but only small. So we quite it went quite smooth, so that we're happy with that. The crew is still on board. They can change if they want, but they have chosen to stay on board till Dunkirk, so that after the ship has been completely empty, then the crew will change.
Now, for many, the water hyacinth is a menace, an invasive plant that harms aquatic life and helps bacteria and mosquitoes. But Kenyan entrepreneur Dominic Kahumbu is pioneering a machine that turns the weed into clean cooking fuel. Take a look.
On the Kenyan shores of Lake Victoria, entrepreneur Dominic Kahumbu and his team are using rakes in their hands to remove water hyacinth. It's an incredibly invasive plant, covering the surface of the water like a carpet, harming fish and helping mosquitoes and bacteria thrive. But where many see a pest, Kahumbu sees an opportunity.
What we're doing out here on Lake Victoria is we're harvesting this, what everyone considers to be a real menace and a pest, an invasive species, and it has many, many negative connotations to it. But the actual fact is water hyacinth is a blessing in disguise.
And that's because Kahumbu's company, Biogas International, is piloting a machine that converts water hyacinth into clean cooking fuel. Kahumbu says 2 or 3 kilograms will provide fuel for a cooker, making a meal of maize beans over 4 hours.
The gas is tapped from the center of the actual digester tube.
The project, in partnership with drug maker AstraZeneca and the Institute of Sustainability Leadership at the University of Cambridge, has provided the digesters to 50 families in Kenya's western city, Kisumu. That's allowed residents like Tony Otieno to abandon his traditional stove called a jiko. It runs on charcoal, which Otieno says was costing him about $12 per sack.
The gas has no smoke, it has no smell, then it is much faster than the jiko.
But at a cost of $650, Kahumbu acknowledges that they are not affordable for most families in the city. He says the business needs capital investment, and he's looking to the kinds of businesses that want to buy carbon credits to ensure his greenfield project can stay afloat.
Well, finally on the program, let's meet the young champion soaring to the top of the chess world. Tanitoluwa Adewumi and his family fled violence in Nigeria and ended up in a homeless shelter in New York, where he learned the game that changed their lives.
It's just like there was nothing else to do, so I was just like, why not go for it? And that time was in the shelter, so it's just like, why not go for it?
Making us all proud. And just before we go, while many women have welcomed the move by Egypt's parliament to approve harsher penalties for sexual harassment to achieve more deterrence, others say tightening the punishment might place more pressure on women, demanding more deeply rooted reforms. Sex crimes have been an increasing topic of conversation in recent years, with many calling for more action to punish perpetrators and punish victims.
Penalties for sexual harassment and related crimes in Egypt have been tightened and upgraded to felony offences after the parliament approved a bill submitted by Mustakbal Watan political party. Sex crimes have been an increasing topic of conversation in recent years in the conservative Muslim-majority nation, with several high-profile court cases coming to varying conclusions.
This decision is very good. It gives women more rights. It makes women more confident and comfortable when they walk in the streets. I can't walk in certain closed places and narrow streets because I'm scared. This will definitely make a difference.
Dozens of Egyptians began posting accounts of sexual assault on social media last year. But campaigners say there remains a deep-rooted bias in Egypt to place more blame on women for behavior deemed provocative than on men for sex crimes. Rights activists and campaigners fear tightening the punishment for sexual harassment might place more pressure on survivors. In the measure approved last week, the penalty for sexual harassment was increased from a minimum of 1 year in prison to a minimum of 5 years, or a penalty of up to 300,000 Egyptian pounds, up from 20,000 pounds.
We need first for the law to be implemented and to protect those who report cases. Last year, a law was passed to protect the identity of sexual assault survivors, and this is a good step. But it lacks the protection of witnesses and experts who work on the cases, not just the survivors. Second, we need a unified law against all forms of violence against women.
In situations where a power imbalance was in place because of a professional or familial relationship, or in cases involving the use of weapons or accomplices, The penalty was increased from a minimum of 2 to a minimum of 7 years, in addition to a 10-fold increase of the maximum fine of 500,000 Egyptian pounds.
And that's the program today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Teniola Shobowale.